Good morning and welcome. My name is Jodi Gissel, and I am pleased to welcome you all this morning, and thank you for being here, both here in person and those who are joining us from remote locations. I am pleased and excited to present Patrice Achu, who's going to be defending his final dissertation this morning and presenting his work with us. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our new cohort that has come in today, our 10th cohort. So they are here, their very first day joining us, getting a chance to see what this is leading up to. So welcome, especially to you, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. And with that, I will hand it over to Patrice.
Thank you, Dr. Gissel. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to be presenting my final dissertation in the doctoral program here at UW-Whitewater, titled Internal Audit Function Effectiveness, Investigating Antecedents and After Effects. But before I do that, I do want to acknowledge a few people in the room today. First of all, I dedicate this work to my dad. My dad has been really helpful and very instrumental in my life growing up. He didn't have the chance to pursue higher education up to this level himself because he grew up in a poor village in Africa. And when he couldn't do that, he vowed that he was going to make sure he invests in his kids to make sure that where he couldn't get to, his kids would get to that. And Dad, I am so proud of you. He is here in the room today, and I dedicate this proudly to you. Also, this process was like climbing Mount Everest, and I could not have done that myself. I got a lot of help along the way. More specifically, I want to acknowledge my dissertation committee. First and foremost, Dr. Jodi Gissel. Thank you so much for all the input you gave me, all the time you spent, countless hours. I can't even count how many hours you spent reviewing my work and giving me critical feedback. A lot of the times I almost cried. I think I cried a couple of times, but I got here because of you. Thank you so much. And Dr. Jimmy Peltier and Dr. Hamid Vakirzadeh, both of you have been instrumental in helping me get here today. You've given me critical feedback, constructive feedback, and I could not have been here without your help. I really appreciate you. I want to thank everyone else, all of my other faculty members, as well as all of my other cohort members for all the assistance that they helped me throughout this program. My family has been instrumental in assisting me get to where I am today. My sister Glory Wapon-Fonda has been a great help throughout the way, providing me a safe home, food, throughout the coursework. I thank you so much. And my brother, Dr. Derek Fomba, who is probably watching online today, I want to appreciate your help for being like a dad to me and setting a solid foundation for me here in the United States. I couldn't have been here without you. My brother, Dr. Charles Penn, who gave me significant financial support during the summer semesters, I could not appreciate you for more. I'll be forever indebted to you. Everyone else, my friends and families, my cohort members, my Whitewater Cameroonian community for supporting me throughout this entire program. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I talked about this study is going to be about internal audit function effectiveness, investigating antecedents and after effects. This is the outline of what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be a two-part essay dissertation, which I'm going to walk you through. And just so you know, I'm going to skip through a lot of the literature review because that was covered during the proposal defense phase. It's intentional because I need to focus more on the methods and results today. All right. So what was the motivation of this study? I have been an audit professional my entire career. First in external audit, working at Ernst & Young for over 7.5 years, and then since 2017 in internal auditing. So I understand very well the profession in both worlds, internal audit and external audit. What I've noticed is that the internal audit profession is a key function in a lot of organizations. Why? Because it provides a lot of benefits. Efficiencies in operations, legitimacy, trust with the audit committee, and when they do their work very well, external audit can actually leverage it. However, this profession is highly unregulated, unlike external audit. But there's one body that promulgates guidance that can be used by internal auditors, which is the Institute of Internal Auditors. And this guidance is in what is called the International Professional Practices Framework, from now on now referred to as IPPF. But because this profession is highly unregulated, it has been shown in the literature that very few internal audit functions adhere either in full or in part to the IPPF. Because of that, there is then varying levels of internal audit function effectiveness across organizations. So, talking about internal audit function effectiveness, what is it? What is it in the first place? I would lean a lot on the Institute of Internal Auditors definition, which talks about the obligation to meet customers' expectations and professional responsibilities inherent in conforming with the standards. The IIA actually promises that if internal audit functions adhere to all of the core principles for the internal audit profession, they would achieve maximum efficiency. Yet, as you can see in the literature, there is varying ways in which the internal audit effectiveness is interpreted or operationalized. So what I found is that there is currently no consensus on how to operationalize internal audit function effectiveness. All right, so that's where I come in. My proposal here, the contributions in the literature, is to lean, again, like I said, on the Institute of Internal Auditors guidance and hopefully propose a very comprehensive model that can be leveraged going forward to operationalize internal audit function effectiveness, which would include all of the professional standards. Because, and then that's going to be good because internal audit functions that will be trying to improve their levels of effectiveness can leverage this model going forward. And it'll make it very clear to them once they're using it, if there are any aspects of the IPPF that they're not adhering to. All right, so remember I talked about this essay is going to be two formats. So first, I would investigate the IIA standards, which in this case are the antecedents of effectiveness. Hopefully, those would lead to internal audit function effectiveness. And then once the function is effective, hopefully they would then enjoy those positive after effects, which in this case, things like management misconduct, etc. Okay? So the research gap here is, like I talked about, just to remind you all, literature has identified several factors that lead to internal audit function effectiveness, but very little has been done to get us to a comprehensive approach. And a lot of papers actually say there's no consensus on what identifies as internal audit function effectiveness, and that's what my study is going to identify today. So I talk a lot about the internal audit function, the IIA standards. What are the IIA standards? Let's take a breakdown. There are two main categories. The IIA categorizes their standards in two main categories. You have the attribute standards and you have the performance standards. Starting with the attribute standards first, the standards 1000 series. This is where this standard series addresses the characteristics of the organizations and parties performing internal audit activities, which means these are the indicators of internal audit function effectiveness. So I group them as follows. Standard 1000 series, which is internal audit functions, is appropriately positioned and adequately resourced. So this chapter talks about the internal audit functions having to have a charter and a mission statement. And in those documents that the activities of the internal audit function should be clearly described and understood. And that the internal audit function should have unrestricted access to resources and personnel within the within management structure. Okay, then the 1100 series demonstrating integrity, objective, free from undue influence. That's the internal audit function needs to be independent. And the audit function needs to not subject their activities about internal audit to others. And the chief audit executive should be reporting to the audit committee of board of directors, functionally and only administratively to the CEO of that company. Okay, moving forward, standard 1200 series. This is where there's a requirement for the internal audit function to demonstrate competence and due professional care. What does that mean? It means that they have to have the right qualifications, skills, certifications to effectively perform their duties. And if they can't get those duties, those skills, depending on what they're working on, that the chief audit executive sources those skills from outside of the organization to help fill the gaps that are missing. The last standard here in the attribute standards is the 1300 series, which is the demonstration of quality and continuous improvement. I really call this chapter, the icing on the cake. Why? Because the IIA requires internal audit functions to demonstrate that they are adhering to these standards in totality. What does that mean? That they should constantly be evaluating and re-evaluating themselves on a continuous basis. And if there are any gaps that they identify, that they should be implementing corrective actions to ensure their adherence to the standards. And that once every 5 years, they should also bring in an external independent qualified accountant to review that function in adherence to the standards. And that results of those reviews should be presented to the audit committee of the board of directors as well as senior management and all corrective actions implemented. Then, those are the attribute standards. Again, the indicators of internal audit function effectiveness. The next group is the performance standards, which are the 2000s. And these standards, the IIA describes the nature of IA activities and then provides criteria to evaluate the performance of IA services. So this is where I'm using as the measure of internal audit function effectiveness, right? So I'll be using that as the basis to measure internal audit function effectiveness going forward. So 2 essays. The first one, I dig deep in the literature to really understand what has been talked about relating to internal audit function effectiveness, about the attribute standards. What are those about, which I just explained? I also dug deep into some of the after effects of internal audit function effectiveness, things like management misconduct, corporate governance, and a lot of others. And based on those reviews, I then realized that, yes, there's not a comprehensive model for measuring internal audit function effectiveness, and the result of that is creating that comprehensive model, which hopefully can be used going forward to operationalize internal audit function effectiveness. Then in AC2, what I did is I first and foremost validated that model to make sure that it works and it's doing what it's supposed to do. Then I used it to check for some of those positive after effects, such as management misconduct deterrence, which we'll talk about as we move forward. So let's go in, SA1. So SA1 is where, again, the objective here is to come up with that comprehensive model for internal audit function effectiveness. So in doing this essay, I had these research questions in mind. The first one is, what factors affect internal audit function effectiveness? Okay. Research question 2 was, how do QAIP reviews contribute to the effectiveness of internal audit functions? Remember the QAIP reviews I talked about being the icing on the cake? That's a really important guidance. So how do those affect internal audit function effectiveness? Finally, research question number 3, how does internal audit function effectiveness affect the function's ability to deter management misconduct and be involved in corporate governance and risk management? So bear these questions in mind as I go through it. I also leverage theory in this research. One of the key ones that I looked at was institutional theory. So this one talks about organizations are subjected to rules and regulations to which they must conform to enhance their legitimacy, access resources, and ensure survival. So in the realm of the internal audit study, I take the IPPF standards as those rules and regulations, because the IIA promises that if you adhere in totality to all of those principles, and if they're present and operating cohesively, IA achieves maximum efficiency. The next theory, you can't look at internal audit without using agency theory, right? A contract under which one or more persons, the principals, engage another person to perform some service on their behalf, Jensen and Menkley, 1976. So in the realm of internal audit functions, the IA acts as an agent of organization stakeholders, providing assurance that management is acting in their best interest. Okay, the last theory that I use is the stakeholder theory, which is an individual or group can influence or be influenced by the organization as a result of its activities. So basically, the effectiveness of internal audit functions is dependent on really meeting the needs of all of its stakeholders. This Gramlin and all 2004 paper talks about internal audit functions being one of the 4 main cornerstones of corporate governance, right? Executive management, external audit, internal audit, and the audit committee of the board of directors. Those are the 4 main cornerstones. So internal audit is one key one, and they ought to work in collaborations with all of those other key stakeholders. Okay, so the way that I did this research was the databases that I searched included like EBSCOhost, Academic Search Complete, Business Source Complete, ProQuest, Google Scholar, and I really was focused on the key theme, right, of this study, which was internal audit function effectiveness, corporate governance, management misconduct, those type of things. And then, in terms of the inclusion criteria, I included studies that are peer-reviewed in academic journals and that are published between 2000 and 2023, and that are also in English. I kind of excluded papers that looked like they were still working papers or dissertations, or ones that were not peer-reviewed. In doing so, I arrived at about 44 papers, which I used in this dissertation or in this review. And what did I find? Let's start with the first one, internal audit function effectiveness. Again, like I talked about, the literature uses it, effectiveness and quality interchangeably in the literature. And I'm not going to go through all of the literature cited here, but in a nutshell, what I found is that they operationalize internal audit function effectiveness in varying different ways. Okay, so that was an opportunity then for me to step in and help. So what I did is I'm leaning again on the Institute of Internal Auditors IPPF guidance, and an academic colleague and I independently mapped the core principles to the professional standards. And then we came back and compared notes. When we compared our notes, we were 78% in agreement with our mapping. And then we both discussed and reconciled our differences to come up with an overall mapping of those standards with the core principles. That's what was leveraged then in coming up with a comprehensive model for measuring internal audit function effectiveness, which no study has used so far to operationalize this particular construct. Okay, QAIP. Remember research question number 2 that talked about what is the role of the QAIP review in internal audit function effectiveness? Well, I did find that this standard 1300 is the least adhered to standard in the IIA guidance. Why is that? Even though we see in the external audit profession that, the ones that are subjected to PCA or B reviews provide higher quality audits, and also that peer reviews of external audit firms improve audit activities, right? But in internal audit, the QAIP review, which is their own version of the reviews, is the least adhered to standard. So there is an opportunity here. Can the presence of these QAIP reviews improve audit effectiveness and also lead to some positive after effects, such as management misconduct deterrence? So this is something that I would want to look into further. All right, so management misconduct was another key theme that I was looking at, right, in the literature. As we know, we all remember the WorldCom and the Enron scandals in the early 2000s, right, which eventually then led to the creation of SOX. That led to a lot of regulation requiring external auditors to be overseen by the PCAOB, and that the audit committee be involved in strengthening the external audit function, in retaining them, hiring them, et cetera. But guess what? In SOX, the internal audit function was, however, ignored. And we've also seen in the literature that misconduct firms are low in IF quality and competence during misconduct years and better post-misconduct years in this IGI 2015 paper. And then also that organizations with an IAF or internal audit functions are likelier than those without to detect and report fraud. So there are these positive impacts of the internal audit function, but it is highly ignored, right? And it's highly unregulated. So that's an opportunity there to look at the impact of effectiveness to management misconduct. Okay, the corporate governance debate. I talked about the internal audit function being a part of corporate governance and their importance, right, in that structure, in striking the balance, leaning again on stakeholder theory, right? The IAF serves as one of the 4 theory cornerstones and needs to interact with the other 3 very well. So this complicated position here marginalizes the internal audit functions in the governance debate. Also leaning into the agency theory, it explains the roles and responsibilities assigned to the IA as an agent to the stakeholders of the internal audit function, right? So the opportunity that I have here then is, given that complicated position, what's the appropriate equilibrium of the interactions, right, between IAs and other 3 cornerstones of corporate governance to ensure that balance of power? Okay. So those were the things that I was looking at in the literature. And as I was starting to look at those, other emerging topics were coming up. One of those is this thing about IAF as a management training ground. What that means is that the internal audit function is used as a management training ground where someone gets into the function for a little while, learns the business, understands the business, and then eventually exits internal audit into a different role within the organization. It has pros and cons in doing that. Some of the pros is that you learn the business very well, you understand the risk, and you can better contribute to the organization. Another thing is that it can be used as a way to attract talent into the internal audit function. However, there are also negatives, such as the integrity and objectivity and independence of the internal audit function could be impaired if the function is used as an MTG. So there is an opportunity here. Investigate the correct balance of how the IAF could use its department as an MTG without adversely impacting independence and objectivity as an unbiased function. And also, the literature doesn't really talk a whole lot about using the role of a chief audit executive as a management training ground as well. Maybe investigating that's an opportunity. Other topics that I saw as well include things like outsourcing of the IAF function, IAF reporting, just to make sure that the reports are visually appealing and insightful, value-adding activities of the internal audit functions, et cetera. In all of these areas, I summarize them in a lot of detail in the paper and recommend areas of future research. Okay, so what are the contributions of ASA1? By far, the biggest one is the comprehensive model, which I created, that can then be used going forward as a good measure for internal audit function effectiveness. And I also identified all those other positive after effects and opportunities there for future research. This is the model I'm talking about. Again, on the left here is all the indicators of IAF effectiveness, the standard 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, and 1,300, all leading to internal audit function effectiveness, which are operationalized using the performance standards, as we talked about earlier, the series 2000s, right? And in this previous slide, I not only propose that model, I actually show how to measure it here with specific guidance. Okay. So that's essay one. Just like any other study, this one doesn't come without limitations. So the limitations here is my review focused mostly on existing published work, and the parameters restricted my findings to peer-reviewed and academic journals. So future researchers should consider expanding the scope of the review to see if additional insights could be obtained. Also, the developed model that I showed in the previous slides needs validation. I would hopefully demonstrate how to validate that on the next essay. And the initial research questions did not include some of those emerging topics that I just talked about earlier. All right, essay 2, the impact of internal audit function effectiveness and quality reviews on management pressure to suppress findings. So in this essay, what I found in looking at the literature, remember I talked about the IIA guidance, that's what I'm gonna be focusing on. I found that, and the IIA has said that for internal audit functions to be as effective as they should be, all of those guidance need to be in place and operating effectively. So, but when I was reviewing the literature, I found this common practice of cherry picking in the existing work, the aspects of the IPPF that is leveraged to operationalize internal audit function effectiveness. For instance, the one study might use a pad of standard 1,000 to operationalize effectiveness. Another one might use 1,200, 1,300 pieces and bits of it. But no one study really used all of the guidance in one spot to really operationalize internal audit function effectiveness. So I'm going to try to do that. This is my research model. If you see the hypothesis 1A through 1D at the top there, 1A through 1D, that is where I'm validating that model that I promulgated in essay 1. So showing all of hypothesizing all of those attribute standards, 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, 1,300, positively leading to internal audit function effectiveness. Once I do that, then I leverage that model to do hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3. So effective internal audit functions would lead to, would negatively impact management's ability to pressure internal auditors to omit significant findings from their audit report. That's what I'm using here as management misconduct. Okay, and then I also look at quality assurance and improvement programs, that internal audit functions that would have these programs in place would negatively impact management's ability to pressure the function to omit or suppress significant findings from their audit reports. Okay, so this is me hypothesizing to validate that model. Hypothesis 1A, IAFs that are appropriately positioned and adequately resourced will positively impact effectiveness. 1B, IAFs that demonstrate integrity, objectivity, and independence will positively impact their effectiveness. 1C, competence and due professional care of internal auditors would positively impact effectiveness. And finally, 1D, QAIP reviews of internal audit functions would have a positive and significant impact on internal audit function effectiveness. So those hypos right there is me validating that model that I proposed in essay 1. And then once I did that, I then moved forward to hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3. So hypothesis 2 then is saying, okay, now we figured out internal audit function effectiveness. Hypothesis 2 then says internal audit function effectiveness is negatively related to the likelihood of management pressuring IAs to omit or significantly suppress findings from internal audit reports. And hypothesis 3 says QAIP inspections of IAFs are negatively related to the likelihood of management pressuring IAs to omit or suppress significant findings from their audit reports. Okay, so what is the data that I used in accomplishing this? I did not use my own survey. I used secondary data. And the source of that data came from select number of questions from the IIA CBOK. CBOK stands for Common Book of Knowledge 2015 data set. The CBOK 2015 data set is the current state of knowledge, of IA knowledge worldwide. And this survey is administered to over 150 countries. But I noticed that you might be thinking that maybe that data is too old, but you can see that that data is still being used in recent studies today in internal auditing. Okay, so what I did is I filtered the data for any missing variables, and by so doing, I arrived at a sample of 269 United States-based respondents only, which I then leveraged in this study. Okay, so I have two main equations. The first equation here is the validation of that model of IAF effectiveness, right? This is where I'm hypothesizing all of those attribute standards or the indicators of internal audit function effectiveness. And then the second model is me using it then to test this dependent variable of management pressure to omit or suppress significant findings from internal audit reports. Okay, so in order to do that, because again, this was not my data, so I had to clean up the data and use it, make it fit for purpose. So the first thing I did was identify the survey questions from the CBOK survey data set that related to each of my variables, mapped those questions to each of them, and then I had to recode the questions accordingly to fit what I was trying to accomplish. For example, remember in Standard 1000 where I talked about, there is a requirement that the audit firm has unrestricted, or the internal audit function has unrestricted access to management and resources. Sure enough, in looking in the CBOK questions, number 86 there was just that. It was addressing just that. And it says, in your opinion, to what extent does the internal audit department at your organization have complete and unrestricted access to employees' property, records, as appropriate for the performance of the audit services? That fits perfectly well in Standard 1000. So I mapped it to that. Next thing I did was I then had to record it, because the options here are 1, all of the time, 2, most of the time, 3, some of the time, and 4, none of the time. So to make it fit for purpose, what I'm saying is all of the time, if they have unrestricted access all of the time, that would mean the maximum positive impact on AP and error, or that Standard 1000, so I assign a score of 1. If it's most of the time, it means some positive impact, so I assign a score of 0.05. Some of the time, a little impact, so I assign a score of 0.25. None of the time means no positive impact, right, on AP and error, so I assign a score of 0. So I did this for all of those questions, and then what I ended up doing is I standardized all of the scores, to use the Z-scores, and the reason for that is to make sure that all the questions had a level playing ground and no individual question was contributing more to the overall score of that section than another. And the reason I did that was because those questions were not measured on the same scale. All right, so again, in validating that model, this is all the test variables. And then I also controlled for listed firm, IAF H and IAF size, which is consistent with literature. And that's the equation there at the bottom. Next, model 2, which is significantly suppress important findings from the audit report. This is the second equation here. And the question that I used also came from the CBOK survey. And this is the question. During your internal audit career, have you experienced a situation where you were directed to suppress or significantly modify a valid internal audit finding or report? So in this situation, 1 is set for no. So 1 is set for no, which means you've never been asked, right? So that would mean a positive thing. No one has asked you to suppress findings. 0 for all other responses, which means that there is evidence that management has approached this auditor to suppress findings from the internal audit report. So in doing that then, as you can see, it means that dependent variable is a dichotomous variable with only 2 options, yes or no. So the only type of regression I can use here is a logistic regression, binary regression, because of that dichotomous nature of the dependent variable. And the 2 independent variables here are quality assurance and improvement program and internal audit function effectiveness. And I also then controlled for the other attribute standards and other control variables mentioned in model 1. And that is the equation there that I used in that second one. Before I went ahead and started my analysis, I made sure, because again, this was not my data, I made sure to check the data for normality. So I ran different bear curves, starting with the first dependent variable in equation 1, internal audit function effectiveness. And as you can see, it is very nicely distributed with a bell-like curve centered around the mean. So it looks like the data looks good. Then I went to the second variable, which is the frequency to suppress findings, because again, it was a dichotomous variable. I was mostly focused on making sure that there is variability in the responses. And as you can see there is between the pressure and no pressure, and it looks normally distributed. Next, I also looked at, all of my independent and control variables for normality. For the most part, a lot of them looked normal, except for AP and error on the top left corner. You can see there is tilted too much to the right, and then IAF size on the bottom right is tilted too much to the left. So it kind of signifies that there might be some outliers in that data. And when you look at AP and error, it looks like the outliers are mostly stuff that's -10 and below. And then for IAF size, stuff that's mostly above 4. So, well, it looks like there is some issues with the data here. To confirm that, I checked the kurtosis statistics information for all of those variables. And I was looking for anything that's over 3, any score that's over 3 underneath the kurtosis statistic. And sure enough, you can see the AP and error has a kurtosis statistic of 5.621, which would suggest there is outliers. And even though IAF size is below 3, it's close enough at 2.984. So I did see that there is some outliers. So what I had to do then, again, is take out those outliers. And I leveraged the Windsorization technique in SPSS to take out those outliers. And after I did that, I reran the bear curves again to check, just to see that the data looks a little bit better now, and it looks more normally distributed now. And then once I did that, I then redid the kurtosis analysis again, just to check, just to make sure that everything now is below 3, and sure enough, they're all below 3. So now I think the data is good to go, and I can use it in my analysis. So what did I find, folks? All right, so the results. Looking at the model validation, first and foremost, I was very pleased to confirm that my model was working the way it should. I found strong support on each of the attribute standards, positively leading to internal audit function effectiveness, starting with AP and error. You can see there the beta is positive with a p-value of 0.004, thus H1A is supported, which means that internal audit functions that are appropriately positioned and adequately resourced would have better effectiveness levels. Then, moving to the next one, INT and IND. Positive beta, p-value of 0.047. Again, supporting hypothesis 1AB, which means that internal audit functions that are independent and demonstrate integrity would enjoy better effectiveness levels. Then QAIP, again, positive beta, p-value, sorry, I skipped one. C and DC, positive beta, p-value of less than 0.001. So really strong support there for hypothesis 1C, which means that internal audit functions that demonstrate competence and due professional care are better in the effectiveness levels. Last, QAIP, positive beta, p of 0.013, supporting H1D, which means that internal audit functions that have a quality assurance and improvement program in place would enjoy better effectiveness levels. Okay? And also I checked the control variables, and as you can see, all of them are for the most part supported with positive betas and good p-values, with the exception of IAFH, which had a p-value of greater than 1, which was not supported. So I did not find evidence then that older internal audit functions would enjoy better effectiveness levels than the younger ones. I would suggest this area for future research for people to take a look at this particular variable. Going then to the second equation, which was now me using that model to investigate pressure to suppress findings. So I did find some evidence that effective internal audit IAF effectiveness on pressure to suppress has a modest negative impact. So that was my hypothesis, that there's going to those internal audit functions that are more effective are going to be less likely to be approached by management to suppress findings. And I did see there, you see the negative beta and a p-value of 0.061. So there is some support there. So hence, I conclude that hypothesis 2 is supported. However, I was not able to find sufficient evidence relating quality assurance and improvement program to the likelihood of management being approached by, for the likelihood of internal audit being approached by management to suppress findings. So you can see that the p-value is greater than 0.1, hence hypothesis 3 is not supported. All of the control variables were also not supported in the second equation with the exception of IAFH. However, the beta there is positive and significant, so which would suggest that older IAFs are actually more likely than not to be approached by management to suppress significant findings from their audit reports. So that's what came out. It was a control variable. So I did not do a lot of theory review on this. I'll suggest that area for future research. Okay, so what are some conclusions here that I'm suggesting from this paper? Again, the biggest one is that this paper is going to advance the internal audit literature and suggest the adherence to the IIA professional standards, because it was just in theory. Now we can see that those standards do indeed positively lead to internal audit function effectiveness. Also, chief audit executives can leverage this study to improve the standing of their internal audit departments, and the internal audit functions and audit committees can finally embrace the QAIP reviews to improve their organizational input. Remember, we talked about the QAIP being the least adhered to standard. Finally, they can embrace that because we've seen a strong positive relation of that process to internal audit function effectiveness. Last, and I think actually the most important, is that scholars can leverage my study by utilizing that comprehensive internal audit function effectiveness model that I've proposed. Because as we've seen in the literature, there is that practice of cherry picking what is used to operationalize internal audit function effectiveness. Same like ASA1, this one also has limitations. Again, I limited to peer review work that has been published in English. I also use secondary data from the CBOK survey, which increases that risk of omitted variable bias. And then one key thing too is the CBOK survey questions published do not have company identifiable information. So I don't know what company these internal audit functions are working in. So then it's very hard to link this study to other positive after effects, such as financial reporting quality, etc. So it's very hard to do that. And then there is a limitation in the data on that dependent variable in equation 2 about management misconduct, the propensity for management to request changes to internal audit report. There was a variability in that. And what's that variability? What's that challenge, limitation to that question? The limitation to that question was that they did ask that, but they actually didn't ask the respondents if they succumbed to those requests. So I'm thinking that if we can include that little nuance to it, it might give us better insights to what we're trying to accomplish here with this particular construct. Okay? There is also the possibility of errors in the data, even though I think that if errors are present, it would for the most part be noise. But just to let you know that there is that possibility. And just a couple discussion points. One thing to note is the cost of implementing an internal audit function can be pricey, right? What I found is that it can cost about $3,900 or so on average per $1 million in revenue to implement an internal audit function. And that cost actually can go up all to $14,000 per $1 million in revenue. So the cost can be significant. And to compound that, implementing a QAIP process can be expensive as well. Remember, the QAIP process includes an independent review every 5 years also. So if you bring in a Big Four firm, bear in mind, sometimes they can charge upwards of $1,000 per hour, depending on who is performing the work. So it can be expensive implementing these programs. So I would recommend that there's no one size fits all. Companies and functions need to evaluate their independent needs based on their requirements. And then also that's an area of future research too, to see if we can investigate a balance, right, of internal audit function effectiveness model that is customizable based on different company characteristics, such as size and revenue, etc. And that really concludes the presentation today. And I would welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrice. So I will kick off with a couple of questions. The first, you started to, are we okay, Nick? Okay. We started to address in your last couple of points there, but just going back, if you could speak to a bit of why Standard 1300, the QAIP, is the least most adhered to. I know you had to cut back a little bit from your paper, what you had here, but I think that that's important to speak to. So if you could just share that with everyone a little bit first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes back to that discussion point that I had at the bottom of the last slide there, which the cost of implementing this program, right? Because the QAIP has an internal piece, which is you self-evaluating, and assessing yourself on a continuous basis. Then once every 5 years, you have to bring in a third party as well to evaluate it. I actually work at a function right now where we just did one. We brought in Deloitte to do an evaluation, right? A QAIP, external QAIP review. That review took 1 week, and guess how much it cost? It cost almost $200,000 to do that review. So it's a hefty price. That's why I'm suggesting that, look, functions need to evaluate their independent needs, and there really can't be a one-size-fits-all approach in this. So I'm hoping that we can take a look at that in future research.
Thank you. Somewhat related to that, if you could just explain a little bit, in your hypothesizing in SA2 with H3, your focus on the QAIP. And again, you didn't have as much opportunity with our time to share the development and what led to each of those specifically. But why did you specifically choose that aspect to hypothesize on?
Okay. The reason for that is because I think this QAIP review process is really important because it covers all of the standards in totality. And, it talks about you adhering to all of the professional standards, right? And if you know that you are going to be reviewed as an internal audit function, you're most likely to be performing your service, your function right? Because you know you're going to get reviewed and challenged on your conclusions. So that was my expectation and thought process, was that if you know you're going to get reviewed, you're probably going to do a really thorough job. And if management knows that you're not going to botch, right, they probably would be less likely to continue mounting those requests. So that was my thought process, was that I was thinking that functions that are doing these reviews would be less likely to approach by management, because management is going to be less likely to, because internal audit would be less likely to succumb to those requests. And why is that? Because they know that they would be challenged. So it was kind of like a chain that I was thinking, and had literature that I used to build that argument in my hypothesis development.
So why do you think you didn't find that?
Yep.
What do you think? Why not?
What now? Well, my hope is that this distinguished panel would hopefully approve me today. And if they do, what now is going to be, I will take a deep breath and probably sleep in for like a week, finally, and just let the glory sink in. And then after that, look, I do think that this is a really important topic, especially that model. So I can't wait to actually work in publishing that and sending it out there so people can start using that model to operationalize internal audit functions and be aware of it. And then also there is a lot of other things in this profession that I'll be interested to continue to explore. One of those would be the CAE role as a management training ground. Another area would be, look, the IIA is currently working on new guidance. It's currently in testing mode right now. So see what that guidance is and see how I can, modify my model to accommodate the new guidance. That would be interesting to do. Another thing also is I'm a practitioner, so I'm not a professor. So it would be really interesting to see how I can do some more engaged leadership type studies, that would be more appealing to practitioners and potentially publishing as well in some practitioner journals. So that's where I'm seeing this going forward from here.
I'm excited to see that. Good. I'm going to pass it off to Jimmy. And
well, am I on? On. I don't hear it, but it must be out there. So I'm glad there's a cohort here, although they're leaving good. Then they won't get scared from the next step. But you've done your dissertation, Chair, proud. You've done your committee, proud. You've done the program, proud. And I think you've made your family quite proud too. You did a really good job.
Thank you.
Your presentation skills were really off the chart. And you may want to consider a career in academics because you'd be really good in front of the classroom.
Oh, thank you.
So, as second chair, my job is a little bit different than, your first chairs. So there's things that perhaps I would have changed throughout the process, but we always know the best dissertation is one that's done. So it's the next step when we start thinking about how do we prepare for what reviewers will say. I think I'm going to focus my comments there, and I'd like to work backwards. So if you can grab your little mouse and work your way backwards to your results, first of all. So if you look at your first model, it's nice to have striking results. It'll also probably be good to compare the betas so you can statistically show which of those effects are strongest.
Okay.
I mean, you can kind of do it by looking at t-tests and whatnot, but given the size of some of these betas, relatively speaking, some of these, let's just call them paths, are going to have more impact than others. That's a good thing for a paper showing which of the effects are strongest. And in this case, the R-squareds are pretty good for model 1. So if you can look at your second model, so these results aren't very strong in their current format, even though H2 is significant. The R-squares are quite small. So the question is, what can be done in the next paper that might make them, stronger? And there's some, there are some possibilities. One of which, if you could go to your coding of the variables, because this is probably one of the things that, can you go back to how you coded your variables? It's likely one of the things that reviewers are really going to have some thought on. So the yes, no, can't do anything about that because basically you're stuck, and that's in many ways why you may not have gotten that result, because 0-1 scales are just less powerful than if you're, go ahead.
Yep, I did some robustness test as well. So in just reviewing this particular one, so I actually use a categorization then methodology on this particular one just to see, and then run a linear regression because now it's no longer dichotomous, and I basically had identical results.
Yeah, so this screams for collecting data on your own because your scales are actually contracting the possible effect sizes. And for Model 1, the fact that you actually found some results in a scale that you made up suggests that if we collect more data from trade associations or whatever, that you can actually have more interval-like scales. I think you're going to find, different things. Can you move back to your other coding?
Yes.
And you probably experimented here. Is that your none is 0, 0.25, 0.5, 1. When you might get a reviewer to say, well, why didn't you code it 0, 0.33, 0.671, which more approaches an interval scale. So I don't know if you looked at different coding here, but I would experiment because that may show a different result because how you coded it is going to have an impact on the results. And again, it screams for collecting your own data because you can have a scale that's more interval-like, more variation. So I think I would look to see if to what level can differences in recoding lead to different results. Okay, can you go backwards now to your model, your visual framework? So what journals also like to get and you could know this from your regression, my multivariate class.
Yep.
It'd be nice to know if there are any moderators. So if you can do an arrow into H1, A to D, H2, H3, if there's some moderation going on, you may find it may parse out the results, and it may be significant for one part of the moderator, but not the other. Is there data? Are there data that can be used as moderators besides the control in your data set?
I would have to look into that. I mean, the data is very extensive. There's a lot of questions in that. So, yeah, it's certain. I welcome that suggestion. I can certainly take that back and take a look at other moderators that I could introduce. Because
the biggest payback might be, does it impact the R squared or the results for H2 and H3? Because H1, A through D, you're pretty solid. This may be a way of saying, well, H3 wasn't significant, but when we include, then for this group, so that's how that might play out.
Okay.
So I don't know what's in your data set, but it again screams for you collecting data, is you can collect your moderators or mediators. Also, for a paper going forward, you probably would want to look at. You have your direct effects for each of those hypotheses, but what about the extent to which IAF effectiveness mediates the relationship between the indicators and management pressure? So you have that may show something else as well, because it's just some things that could enhance what's going on in your paper. So I would look for: are there any moderator? Is there other data?
Right.
That may get some of these findings to be stronger? Because if you're a reviewer, my initial result would be, well, really just H1 through HD is really the main part of this paper, because the other stuff, it just didn't have very good R squared or non-significant. That's the barrier you have to overcome at the paper writing stage. So, did you try recoding to 0, 0.33, 0.671?
So I actually leverage literature because there are other studies that have used the same data set. And
No, but did you?
So I used similar codings that they used in that study.
I would just look at it because that may change everything you have here.
Yeah.
Right? Because you could logically say you needed to, and there's a research methodology. If you're trying to approach an interval scale, that they should be interval-like. And yours is not interval-like because the interval scale has equal differences between scale points.
Right.
So as you see, most of my stuff is how can we perhaps find other, make your results stronger. And,
right.
Just a few other things that I have. So what's your most surprising result?
My most surprising result, I suppose, was, the weak results on the management pressure. Of course, I was really excited about that hypothesis 2 and 3. And that was my surprise there. And then also the control variable, which again, I didn't really hypothesize it, the one on IAFH, not having actually being significant for management pressure, but having a positive impact. So that was surprising to me to see that older IAFs are instead less likely or more likely to be approached by management to suppress those findings. Suppress findings from their report.
What's your most impactful result? One result. What's the biggest one?
My biggest one by far is my model validation, hypothesis A1 through D. Having that strong validation there of that model gave me I was very happy about that. So I was very pleased with that.
So one last point, this is back to the moderator, even though it is a 0-1. If your model was IAF effectiveness the indicators into effectiveness and the moderator was management pressure, I'd be interested to see if that has a moderator effect.
Okay.
Because then you could change your model and it would look different.
Yep.
I mean, of course, it may be zip. Maybe there's nothing there.
Yeah.
What we need to find is other ways to get the other parts of your model stronger. So, great job. I was just very, very impressed with your presentation. Jodi's obviously, did a great job, as you proceeded through this process.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pelter. Thank you.
Hamid?
Okay, awesome. Patrice, good job. I enjoyed your presentation as well. I think you've come a long way from the beginning of this project. And I think you have a good chance of getting this published because of how novel the idea is. My main concern was what Jimmy brought up about the interval issue that you have. I was wondering why you didn't use intervals of 1 and you decided to go to decimals. So I think that would actually, the most obvious problem with that is that you're basically giving more weight to some of the categories by choosing how you give them the score. Like, for example, when you give the 0.5 or 1, they essentially get higher weight in your analysis. So it's, I think the main, Jimmy raised again, the main issue when it goes to the review process is to actually validate this measure in a more standardized way.
Okay.
Other than that, I wanted to ask about other robustness tests that you want to include in this paper later when you submit to review.
Can you repeat that question, Hamid, about the robustness test? Sorry.
So what are some robustness tests that you have considered to validate your results?
Okay. So The main one that I ran was that one that I talked about on the management pressure to suppress findings, which was, coding in a as a categorical variable versus a dichotomous variable to see if I was going to get, different results. But I still got identical results. So there is an opportunity as well, for sure, in running other robustness tests as well. But that was the main one that I ran.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Hamid. Thank you.